It's a funny place to be, stuck in a seemingly mundane world with an inner knowing that the universe is so much more than our mortal minds can comprehend. Yet we all have the capacity to know peace and our oneness with the wholeness of life. And through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share this possibility. I'm Ryan Kurczak, and this is the Kriya Yoga Podcast.
I'm ready.
You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Here we go.
Take one.
Yes. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Kriya Yoga Podcast. I'm here with David McGrath, a good friend of mine, Kriya Yoga teacher, Kriya Yoga coach. I've known him since 2008, and we did a podcast probably, it might be nearly a year ago now, depending on when this gets posted. But David, he's been reinvigorating his teaching practice, and also he recently has been doing a 4-week class on the depth of meditation, going deeper in meditation for our Patreon community, the Journal of a Kriya Yoga Teacher at Patreon. So welcome back, David. It's great to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be back again.
Yeah. So, we tried to figure out what we were going to talk about today, because last time we chatted, you mentioned that there were all these things you wanted to talk about, but now you're just
They've all evaded me. Yeah, it's funny how that can happen. Things can seem so important in one moment, and then just right now, they're not coming to mind at all.
Yeah. Well, I have an idea of what might be fun or interesting for our listeners to talk about today. And it's kind of a broad topic, but it does obviously focus on Kriya Yoga. And that is, I've been contemplating the phrase, or I guess the group of words, the art and science of Kriya Yoga, or the idea that Kriya Yoga is both an art and a science. And this was prompted because one of the attendees from the Kriya Yoga Apprenticeship Program, when we had a retreat together at Center for Spiritual Awareness, she was from Sweden. And she asked me very directly, she said, well, why is it called a science? And I thought about that, and I have my ideas, but I'm curious, based on your experience, if someone asked you, why would we call Kriya Yoga a science? What would your response be?
Why would we call it a science as opposed to an art, or just why would we call it a science?
Well, we'll get to the art part next,
okay.
But let's focus on the science at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I've heard other people commenting that Kriya Yoga is a science just because it's a strategic approach which has been practiced and the results have been proven, and that it has been done multiple times. So in that sense, it's something which is can be applied and can be repeated by anybody who applies it in an effective manner. So in that case, it's kind of scientific. I always think of something which is scientific as being linear. There's a kind of a step-by-step pattern that goes to it, and that it's by following that pattern, you're able to get to the place that it's saying that you can go to. So that's the way I see science. I won't get into art yet because I just don't want to move too fast.
Well, we do have some time. So then I guess the next question would be, there are many people practicing Kriya Yoga, and many people either seem to get different results, or some people will be doing it for 5 years and they'll go so deeply into it that they very easily can say, yes, this is a repeatable science. And there are other people that spend a long time, learning the meditation, working at it, and they might wonder to themselves, well, I'm not sure how repeatable this is because I've been at it for 20 or 30 years and I'm not sure what I've been doing. So when you think about that kind of difference in individuals, why do you think that there might be that kind of different appreciation or experience of Kriya Yoga if it is a science?
I think it just comes down to mind. The nature of mind is just so, there's so many layers to it. And even if you're to look at the other sciences like psychology, and even philosophy and the way people interpret and understand things, the same could be true of yoga in terms of it being a philosophy, a psychology, and a practice. So people will apply the same practices, but the way that they apply those practices, well, first of all, they might be interpreted differently, and then they might be applying them with a slightly different approach or a slightly different angle. And then there's just the way you're introduced to the practices through different teachers, different traditions, and with different slants and approaches that could just all have an impact on the scientific approach in itself. Trying to make it a bit clearer, when you look at psychology and you've got different schools of psychology, and then they're considered science, it's considered a science, and the different schools have different approaches to achieving the ultimate goal, which is to help the person to experience mental health or mental well-being. With yoga, it's in terms of that, it is a science, but again, the different schools, different traditions might take a different approach to it, and in the individual in themselves, just on the nature of their own mind when they come to it, could end up finding it being different experience to maybe somebody else that has relayed their experience or whatever.
Mm-hmm. It was kind of a trick question because
right, you set me up.
I did set you up because I remember visiting with Mr. Davis, and after going to a lot of retreats and kind of wondering this question, well, why is it that some people seem to kind of get it really quickly, and other people it seems to take a while? And his answer was, if I had the answer to that question.
All right, so here I am claiming to have the answer. Oh, good. You set me up. It's all right. It's all right.
No, I think you hit the very important point there that basically temperaments are different. Someone recently sent me a book that was the final talks of one of Ramana Maharshi's students, and he would talk often about that there was a different kind of ripeness or maturity of a spiritual seeker or someone who's practicing self-inquiry, and that when someone is a little bit more mature or a little more, he used the word advanced, I think, that it's easier for them to understand what's going on quicker, or it seems like that, versus when people are coming to it and they have a lot of things to get through, false ideas, that's often what can take a bit longer. So, I mean, I do feel that your answer was appropriate, because it's the same with psychology. Why is it that some people can, go to a counselor 2, 3, 4 times and feel like they've got it, and then other people, they might spend a few years, and that's just because they might have a little more work to do.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to people then, when you are talking to them and maybe they become a little discouraged or, want things to happen quicker than they are? What kind of advice would you give to someone to help them stay focused on their inner work?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
It's not a trick question.
Yeah, I'm wary of them now.
Yeah.
But you're asking in terms of what advice would I give them in them seeing yoga as a science, as a strategic approach, that they're maybe getting a little bit, maybe a little bit fatigued, maybe a bit frustrated, maybe starting to doubt themselves in their own practice.
Right.
Yeah, like, on a little reflection on this, like I've of late been just looking at yoga as a term and the concept of yoga, and I remember Roy used to talk a lot about our using discriminative intelligence and our ability to discern different, in terms of our life choices, our lifestyles, and also within our formal practice, and that idea of being able to discern is what Roy was implying, that through our powers of discernment, we're able to find out the truth from the untruths. And this is something we do in our formal practice, but then in our daily life, we can also do that as well, making decisions which are guiding us towards a life which is supportive of our own well-being and the well-being of all of manifestation. And so if someone's having doubts, when we first come across yoga, we're usually quite enthralled by everything that it is and everything that it embodies, and then sometimes by the personalities who are representing it, and the different traditions and different things. There's a lot of we can be very inspired initially, and then we sit down to do it and we endeavor to apply ourselves, but it can just be a little bit more of a task than we had expected. And as that goes on for weeks, months, and years, those years, that's when I like to just see yoga practically as the capacity to discriminate and discern. And I was just reading up in the Yoga Sutras about how that capacity to discern, I think it's in the first book, it's described as the continuous reapplication of practice, and it's also the ability for non-attachment. And I like to see those two as being two sides of one tool, which is discrimination. Mm-hmm. So if somebody says that they've, the initial motivation and their initial faith and conviction and determination to succeed in the process is waning a little bit, and they're starting to doubt themselves a little bit, well, you can just turn around and say, well, have faith and pray for faith and this kind of thing. But I think it's just like anything else that we're applying ourselves to, the repeated application and the ability just to let go of the failures, the ability to kind of just accept them for what they are and to move on. And so if somebody was going to, if I put it simply, because you don't want to keep the person there for hours if they say that they are having doubts, they mightn't have a whole hour for a podcast. So it would just be a case of saying, well, it's like everything else. You kind of just have to pick yourself up and reapply yourself and reapply yourself and reapply yourself. And the conviction that you had there at the beginning, it will ebb and flow. But I don't want to get into it too prematurely, but that's where the art side of it is. Because it's not linear. It's not in that sense, it's not scientific. It's not a linear process, because the reapplication of yourself, it takes that it's going to question the doubting mind, and it's going to put you at points when you might just feel like giving up. So I've trailed on a little bit there. What would I say to somebody? I would say just reapply yourself continuously, and that's just the way life is anyway.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I like that. I don't want to get into the art part just yet.
No, yeah, I'm very tempted.
But me too. And one thought that came to mind about that, which I'll throw out and then we can come back to it, is the idea of art and science. I've considered that, and even someone who goes to study surgery or medicine, there's a big difference between what they learn in the classroom, which is probably the science of it, the linear, this is what you do, versus now you're in it and there's the person on the operating table and now you have to adjust, you have to use the information you have and adjust to what's actually going on right now. And the same thing that you mentioned earlier about people and sort of different situations in their life. Well, they learn the science of it, which is the general idea and structure, but then the art is probably going to be, well, how does that apply specifically to your life in particular?
Yeah.
One thing before we get into that, one thing that I've been kind of focusing on a good deal lately is the first probably 4 or 5 sutras in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and how it essentially lays out that yoga is abiding as the self. Yoga is abiding, the best words I think we can use, which is still not accurate, abiding as the witnessing presence. And then how it goes on, I think Sutra 4 or 5 in chapter 1, it says, otherwise, meaning if you're not abiding as the self, then you are defining yourself through things. Otherwise, you are conforming to definitions, is what it says. But then it not very far past that, it starts to say that practice of yoga. It tells you what practice of yoga is. Practice of yoga is abiding as the self and not practicing non-attachment. Yeah. Right. And what I'm leading to here is one thing I've noticed is if you ever step back and watch the mind, you mentioned the idea of the mind. If you ever step back and watch the mind, one day you're going to be waking up and ready to go. Yes, I can't wait to meditate. I can't wait to go do my work. I can't wait to exercise. I can't wait to enjoy my family. The next day, you don't feel like doing a lot of that. And then maybe 3 days it's great. And then 2 days it's not. And I think if people watch their minds, they might start taking it less seriously.
Yeah.
And if you start taking your mind a little less seriously, it makes it easier to abide as the self and to practice non-attachment. Yeah, you have any thoughts on that?
That makes perfect sense. Just the ebb and flow, the being in the mood, the being, as you say, the desire to do something, the desire to apply yourself to the practice, and then other days when you're not in the mood, not in that frame or in that space. And then because it fluctuates, it's just evidence of it just being unreliable and not being on your side, so to speak, not being there to kind of support you. And that is, I suppose, like you were talking there about the practice and the non-attachment. So I just like to see that as discrimination. There are two sides of that capacity to discriminate. Because on that day when you do wake up and you might be in the mood to sit and meditate, but you're able to discriminate, well, that's great. It's favorable. It's going with me. But then on the day when you wake up and you're not really, you're inspired to do your formal practice, but you can discriminate that again, that it's okay. Well, it's not supporting me today, but I got to do it anyway. So yeah, just breaking down that capacity to discriminate, what is always going to be in favor of you adhering to your practice and in favor of you making choices which are going to support your practice, both informally and informally. But basically, discriminating discriminating in favor of the choices which are going to help you to abide in that witnessing presence, in that clear state of pure conscious being that you are, and then just breaking that down into the practice and non-attachment. So you talked about just letting go of the mind, letting go of it as being something which is the knowing, because it's not the knowing. It's made up of different faculties, and some of them aren't always really supportive of what we want to do.
Mm-hmm. I think that meditation or having a disciplined practice can help us see that, because, for example, at least what I've noticed is the more I said I was going to do something and I just told myself I'm going to do it whether I feel like it or not, the easier it was for me to recognize it really doesn't matter how I feel.
Yeah. But I think when you're talking about feelings, because they just like thoughts, they just rise and fall. And even, we might sit down with the feeling of, yes, I'm going to do my meditation practice. But even 5 minutes in, we might feel a totally different feeling. There's nothing really, we can't depend on it in any real way. And being able to let go of that sense of needing to have the feeling to be able to do it, that's definitely going to stand to us.
Yeah. And we might be going maybe a little off the deep end here. I don't know. But like when we're having this conversation, because in my own experience, in my own meditation, I've had the experience of being able to see, like you just described, the facts that the feelings and the thoughts, they rise and they fall, and they don't necessarily really matter a whole lot. But I guess what I'm curious is, and this is an issue that I've had talking to people or trying to get that point across, how would you speak to or work with someone who they haven't had that experience? And so to try to tell them that the thoughts aren't important or that their feelings aren't important. And please keep in mind, I'm not saying that ignore your feelings. I don't mean feelings are stupid. I just mean when it comes time to getting things done, you can just, it's just like having a little kid that's yelling all the time. Sometimes that kid's going to yell, and sometimes you listen to it because it's important, but other times it's just yelling, and you just say, look, be quiet. So how do you communicate to people this idea that your thoughts and your feelings, while they have validity in certain situations, when it comes to meditation or your spiritual practice, that they're really just going to rise and they're going to fall, and they're not that big a deal? People who are attached to them. Does this make sense what I'm trying to get?
Yeah, because I really think that we're all, well, I'm going to say we're all attached to them, because that's basically the whole issue of our human condition, is we're all attached to our thinking processes. We're all attached. We all identify with them. It's just that right now I'm identifying them. I would hope to, I like to believe, at a more subtle level. But somebody might, and I definitely for myself, before I got into it, I identified with thoughts and feelings at a, let's say, a more gross level at the beginning of my practice. So if somebody was to come and say, well, what am I supposed to do? Why am I supposed to, I'm not going to say stop my thoughts, but why am I supposed to regulate my thoughts in this way? What's the problem with that? Why can't I just experience them? Isn't this a part of my whole way of being as a human? And while it is a part of the whole way of being as a human, it's the, I wouldn't say to someone, well, just do it. I think a really good way to kind of become a little bit more familiar with the nature of thoughts without having to bite off a big chunk, have to believe that, oh yeah, I'm supposed to just let go of all my thoughts, is just to sit with the thinking processes. Like literally, what I mean is you're not even necessarily trying to use mantra or you're trying to use your breathing, but just if you just, that individual, if they just sat for 5 minutes and you say, okay, you're sitting for 5 minutes, and every time a thought arises, just say thinking, or just say I'm thinking, or whatever you want to do, but just see every single one of those thoughts and just look at it objectively. I'm not telling you to stop thinking. I'm not telling you that you're trying to regulate the thinking. Just do it. And I think just in that you create a little bit of a distance, enough distance, just for somebody to be able to realize that they don't really have any control over what's going on. And I suppose that with that experience, maybe the individual might be more inclined to say, well, I'd like to have a little bit more of a say on what's going on in there, rather than it just to kind of churning out whatever it wants, whenever it wants. Mm-hmm. And then maybe with that, then they'd be more inclined to want to try other practices and examine how they would work in terms of refining the thinking processes. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I think so. One final bit on this idea of the science of Kriya Yoga before we get into the art part. And I think the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is probably one of the prime texts that hold this idea, because in my mind it's like a formula of number one, chapter 1 kind of goes over what's it all about, what's happening here, what's the main point or gist of it all, and then number 2, the practices, since it is chapter 2 is entitled Kriya Yoga, and 3, I don't typically pay a whole lot of attention to chapter number 3, just because I don't know, the whole idea of the cities and the soul powers, it seemed a bit distracting. But then chapter 4, well, once you've almost got it, how do you have to refine it? That's how I see chapter 4. Is it's you've been doing the practice, you understand what's going on, but now how do you refine it to take it all the way to kaivalya, or the aloneness of seeing? So do you, or can you think of a way to describe the fundamental mechanics of Kriya Yoga that makes it a science? Like what is the fundamental principles or underlying things that a person are doing or aiming to accomplish that actually is consistent with everyone, even though it might be applied a little bit differently depending on who you are?
Wow, that's a big that's a big ask. So basically what you're asking me is, how is yoga a science across the board for everybody, regardless of where they're coming from and what they're coming with?
Well, let me just give you an example. So see if this helps. So for example, when we talk about the idea of meditation, well, when someone uses the word meditation, all kinds of things pop up. Yeah. But the mechanics of meditation, whether you're being devotional to a statue of Shiva or a linga, or whether you're just trying to hold your awareness clear in pure consciousness, the mechanic that underlies both of those things is the capacity to focus. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm curious is how you might see what exactly is the underlying mechanic of Kriya Yoga, that these practices help us to achieve or to, activate. Does that example help at all?
In some ways. So what I'm taking from it is, how does Kriya Yoga help to facilitate, like as a mechanic, pure concentration? Is it to the point where the individual, the practitioner, will be able to experience what's promised by yoga. Is that what? I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it.
Yeah. That's the general idea. Like, what is, when you're talking to or working with different people, some of them are going to have to approach it a certain way, but there's still a fundamental principle that they're working through their own temperament that would be the same as, say, person B, even though their temperament might have to approach it a little bit differently. Like the idea, again, I keep going back to the idea of devotion. Some people think that devotion is being caught up in sort of this idea of song and worship for an embodied aspect of God or pure consciousness. But, Ramana Maharshi says that self-inquiry is devotion, because in order to practice self-inquiry, well, you have to be devoted to that which you want to know. So in a way, it's similar, but the approaches of those two individuals, the bhakti versus the jnani, is a little bit different. So that underlying principle is, I guess, what I'm digging at here.
Well, I suppose the underlying principle of yoga as a system is that it's, as we said, it's scientific, that it's got within the Raja system of yoga, you've got the 8 limbs. And so it's a systematic approach which we can break down. And I think you can break it down in 3 levels. You can break it down in terms of our physical well-being. You can break it down in terms of our psychological well-being, and then emotional well-being, and then our spiritual well-being, and our illuminating our consciousness. And I think that when people come, I suppose this is why so many people are involved in yoga on a physical level, is just because that's maybe where they are. Maybe they don't really know what yoga has to offer, but maybe also that they just don't really want to get any deeper than having mind-body awareness. So if somebody was to come and say, well, what are the benefits of Kriya Yoga, like the mechanics of Kriya Yoga as a system? Well, I would say that it encompasses all 3 of those, looking at, well, all 4: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, with the end aim being that by purifying our consciousness and experiencing our essential nature, we'll naturally be able to purify all the other aspects, the emotional, mental, and physical. But that but by working from the other side, then working through the physical and mental and emotional, it creates a kind of a feedback loop. We're able to purify from all aspects, and in this way, it's an integrated system. It's an integrated approach which engages us at all levels of our being: physical, mental, emotional. As you say, through the chanting, it could be, or through the self-inquiry for the intellectual approach. It engages all these different aspects, and in that way, it's not a boring path, and it's also it satisfies all aspects of our temperament. And some people might prefer to adhere to some practices more than others, but it's an integrated system, and it's holistic, and ultimately it can be measured as we continue with it. I feel that because it's adhering to the 8 limbs of yoga, the Raja Yoga system, we're able to look at each of the limbs and see how effective we're being in adhering to each one, and then in that way we can measure our own effectiveness in the practice as a whole. So for me, the mechanics of Kriya Yoga, it serves everybody's needs and temperaments. And it's just depending then on the person where they end up fooling themselves or tricking themselves into where they want to get focused. But all of it's important. Yeah.
Right. Well, moving on to the idea of the art of Kriya Yoga, and this might be just a little bit of a segue. A lot of people get hung up on the specific meditation techniques. I get a lot of questions about, people will send me this long list of these different kinds of techniques and say, well, is this Kriya Yoga? Can I practice Kriya Yoga without doing this technique or that technique? And, I never, and probably like you too, I never learned it that way as an accumulation of techniques. Mr. Davis, when he taught it as sort of an approach to lifestyle, an approach to living. Also, while he did teach specific techniques, which he learned from Paramahansa Yogananda, those weren't considered to be the end of everything. Those were just tools. As Yogananda would say, that they're tools that you use for your purposes. So moving from this idea of science to an art, we've got these techniques, we've got these principles. What would you say to people who feel and think that, well, if I just get this technique right, if I just get this one special formula, then it's all going to work? How do you speak to that when people bring that up to you?
I can relate to that, because although I had years of meditating before I met Roy, and I had years of applying some of the techniques that he had written about in books before I met him. So I did jump on that bandwagon a little bit of whether with this technique and that technique. But I don't think now, looking back, I could really say I did think of it as being scientific back then, but I don't think of it as being scientific now. I think of it as being fanatical now. I think of it as being kind of, if I drive this hammer hard enough through this wall, then it's going to make a hole. But it's not necessarily the case, because the wall could be made of, could have, cast iron in the center of it or whatever. Well, what I'm trying to say is that it's not a 2 + 2 = 4 kind of approach. So that's what I meant earlier, that for me, scientific is linear. Using techniques is not a linear thing, because yes, they do help to kind of move us to deeper states of clarified awareness, deeper states of concentration. They facilitate that process. But they're not going to, if we say, well, I'm going to do this exercise and then this exercise and then this exercise, then I'm going to experience samadhi, or then I'm going to experience a state of enlightenment, and it's all going to be perfect for me then, and I'll be a perfect human being. It doesn't really, that doesn't match up, and it's even just being very, very fanatical about the techniques at all is kind of, in my mind, sometimes avoiding the actual crux of the matter, which is to be able to just experience stillness and to investigate stillness. But if we're always involved in techniques, then it prevents us from having to do that. So if we end up sitting down for an hour meditation and we spend 55 of those minutes just doing pranayama and different exercises and different techniques, well, we haven't really had the opportunity just to sit with ourselves. You sit in, and even though our concentration, I was looking into the concept of samadhi for the workshops that I was offering under your invitation, and it's interesting to just see that we can get very caught up with this idea of experiencing samadhi, and how it's a concept which is kind of a foreign to us to a certain degree. It's spoken about a lot, and of course there's descriptions of it in texts, but I think we can manipulate it in our mind to be something extraordinary which we're going to experience. And so if we do all these different techniques and all these things, and if we're a really, really good boy and we do all our meditation practices just how we're supposed to do them, then we're going to get the icing on the cake, and we're going to get this magical state of samadhi. But I think it's more, it can be more compared to our states of concentration. So when we're sitting down to meditate and we're working through the technique, and the technique will naturally, if we're using it effectively, will calm our mind and bring us to a more purified state of concentration, then that in itself, that is a step in itself, and being absorbed in that state is a step in itself. And then maybe we can just abide there for a while and see how it goes. It could just naturally go deeper. So in that sense, I don't see it as being, I see this as the art side of it. It's allowing your own intuitive knowing of your true essence. We know this, we are this. So it's kind of just allowing that to guide the process a bit more than our rational mind, which is putting in formulas and and just making it all very systematic. Now that's where I suppose the confusion arises, because we're talking about Kriya Yoga as being a systematic approach to experiencing our true nature. but it's also something which we explore and we examine and we get involved in hands-on, like the artist in the workshop. We're straight in there. We may have done all the analytical sketches. We may have looked at the object that we're going to be painting from every which way and done all different mediums and charcoal and paints and graphic pens and whatever. We've done everything. But then when it comes to actually painting the picture, there's a part of us which just needs to let go. We can calculate and do as much as we need to do in preparation, and I suppose that's learning the process of Kriya and learning the techniques. But then when it comes down to doing it, there's an art in being able to let go of it as well. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that comes back to what we were talking about earlier: the repeated practice and the non-attachment. And that's discrimination. It's being able to know that when you're sitting to meditate and you're going through the process, well, what kind of state of mind are you in when you're sitting down? What would be the best object of focus for you to put your attention on? What would be the best technique to help you to elevate your state of concentration? But also all the while being able to accept that there's an internal knowing. There's a knowing within you that maybe it's okay to let go of it and just sit there and be there. So that's the art, I suppose, the intuitive knowing.
Yeah, it made me think of a lot of different things. One of them, I was thinking about music, and you use the idea of an artist. And when someone's playing music, there has to be a science to it. The person has to spend years sitting down, learning where to put their fingers if they're playing an instrument, or learning notes on a scale or modes. But then once they know that, and it comes time to perform or to improvise, well, they've already got it in there. And then the art becomes that natural expression of it. It also reminded me of, excuse me, I was thinking of a show I was watching recently. And in this show, there's a mother who, she just runs around saying, I'm a good mother. I know I'm a good mother, but she just runs around saying I'm a good mother. But she never actually, she doesn't actually do anything that's, that you would want a good mother to do, like actually being there for her child, listening to her child, knowing what her child wants and likes. And all this that you've just discussed made me think that the art part of it, it actually requires a certain level of responsibility. And maybe that's why many people chase specific techniques and formulas, because if there's just do 1 + 2 + 3 = that, and all the responsibility goes to, oh, well, this formula better do it. It's the formula's responsibility, versus the idea, like you said, you use the techniques to access a certain state, but then you have to learn to abide in that state. Just like when you're riding a bike and you've got those training wheels, you use the training wheels so that you get a feel for what it's like to ride upright. But at some point in time, you got to take those training wheels off, and then you have to learn, your body has to actually physically learn how to hold itself up to go in a direction. So everything that you said just kind of brought all this to mind, and it makes me think that the art part of it is more being responsive and paying attention and being alive with it. The idea that keeps coming to mind is being alive with it, being engaged in it, being actively living it, versus just trying to jam it into a particular kind of linear format that's supposed to work for everybody.
Yeah, like your music comparison there just reminded me of an experience which I had. I used to do a lot of African drumming when I went to art college, actually. So I did a lot of African drumming in art college. But I just, the process for me is still very vivid in my mind, because it is very much like what's going on in meditation. So the teacher comes in and they offer drums and they show you there's different rhythms: the earth rhythm, the water rhythm, the fire rhythm. So they're all a little bit more difficult in complexity, but you learn them all. You learn all the different techniques, and you learn on. And then it comes to a point when people who get to choose which rhythm they want to do, and whoever's feeding up to it will take the more difficult ones, and it's like that. So then everybody's sitting together, and then it's woven all together, and he facilitates that. The teacher facilitates that, so they're all woven together, and everybody's playing together. And what happens is your mind is consciously aware of your own rhythm, and you're doing it consciously. But there's other rhythms going on now, and I suppose they're comparable to all the other thoughts that can be going on in your head when you're trying to focus on one thing. And so you've got all these other rhythms going on, and you're trying to focus on your own. But there comes a point when you need to let go of concentrating on your rhythm, because by concentrating on your rhythm too much, you're going to fall victim to the other rhythms. You're going to just be distracted by them too much to be able to follow in a timely way and keep the rhythm. And so you end up going into this void, so to speak, into this space where you are just absorbed in all the rhythms, and you're not aware of the rhythm that you're doing, but it's being upheld in the rhythms that are taking place around you. And it's a meditative state in that sense. And I suppose that's it. In order to experience absorption or samadhi, if we want to use the nice fancy term, but like to be in absorption, we need to be able to let go. So the more we're focused on the techniques and concentrating with effort on the techniques, then we're denying ourselves the opportunity to experience it. We're doing the opposite to what we're actually trying to do. Yeah,
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's trying to get that point across. I mean, those are great examples, and your example of the rhythm and that instruction reminds me of one night when I used to go to. It was called Celtic Week down near Asheville, and they would fly in all these Irish musicians, professional grade Irish musicians, to teach classes. But then at night, once dinner was over, people started gathering in just little pockets of this college campus, beautiful trees. I mean, it was a wonderful evening, and it would go for hours, sometimes even all night long, where musicians would just go and play with other musicians. And I can remember one night in particular, it must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, and we'd been playing for hours. And all of a sudden, there's a sort of common repertoire of tunes that everyone knows. And I was so into it that my fingers just started moving, playing the tune that I didn't know. It was a tune that they had started, the group had started playing, and I had never sat down and learned this tune. But because I wasn't thinking, I just said, "Oh, I know this," and my fingers just started moving and just started playing. And then when we were done, I was thinking to myself, "Wait a minute, I don't know this tune," and then I couldn't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
I couldn't. It's like I lost it. It just, what you described makes me think of that experience. But you had to learn the rhythms in order to be able to do that.
Yeah.
I had to know at least how to move my fingers, and the idea of what key the song was in order to have the capacity to be absorbed in that kind of experience. So I think the science of it is really getting the mechanics down so that your body, your mind, and your consciousness is strong enough to do what it needs to do when it's time to do it, if that makes sense.
Well, like, it's just, I think you reiterated it there really well in terms of once you started concentrating on what you were playing, you got identified then with that thought, so to speak, that I can't do this, that I don't know this rhythm. And once your consciousness was not pure anymore, because the pure consciousness just allows for the expression to happen, but now it's being identified with something. It's not pure anymore, it's entangled with something, and so there's a limitation straight away. And I think that's the crux of, like, when you look at art and people who are involved with creative processes, they'll often talk about, I don't know what, I've been practicing for years, I've been doing this for years, but then one day I was inspired. There's just this intuitive knowing. There's this, if we reconcile ourselves to the fact that we are pure conscious beings, then everything that we cling to is just distorting that. And so the intuitive knowing is, there's moments when we're in touch with it. There's moments when we'll be inspired, even during the course of a day, even little things. We'll make decisions which we'll go, "Oh, I really did well there." Or, we can give ourselves a little pat on the shoulder or different things. But there's the knowing within us what is better for us and what is better for our expression and for the sake of the welfare of all of life. But it's just the identifying with things that it just distorts the consciousness, makes it, and I suppose that's the idea then, that we're just compartmentalized into our own self, and it's not as harmonious with life as it could be. And in meditation practice, I just like to see meditation practice as a little kind of, it's like a little bubble for us to practice in a very, very abstract but very subtle way what life actually is. It's kind of like they're two shows. They're both going on side by side, but ideally we want to be able to do everything that we're doing in meditation practice in our lives, because otherwise, what's the benefit that we're really going to express from meditation within this lifetime?
Right.
And so yeah, that process of being able to just disengage with the identification with the thoughts as they arise. It's okay, they're arising is quite natural, but identifying with it is that's the process. So in our formal practice, we have the opportunity to do it. But if we're always stuck on a technique, then we don't give ourselves the chance to actually practice discriminating between let that thought go, let that thought go. We're always relying on a technique to kind of keep it safe for us, keep the whole practice safe for us. But life isn't safe. So we kind of, if we had our parents or our guardian holding our hands all the time, we'd definitely kick up a fuss. So
Right.
we don't want to have a technique always telling us how to do the thing. We want to actually let go of it at some time.
Well, the idea that came to me when you were discussing that is, the specific techniques, like, for example, pranayama techniques and so on, certain breath holds and those sorts of things, that if you do them with intention and you sink your awareness into them, then most definitely they're going to give you a glimpse of what stillness is like. And that's why they talk about, or the yogis talk about, the breath is attached to the mind. And if you can regulate the breath, you're regulating the breath, not to just get better at regulating the breath. You're regulating the breath to give you a momentary glimpse, ideally, or longer, of, oh, this is what stillness is like. Or this is what it's like when the thoughts are regulated. And then you have to grow into that. It's like, when you're talking to someone who might have anger issues, and you teach them a technique to manage their anger, and they start to recognize, oh, okay, if I count to 10, I don't have to flip out and hit someone. Absolutely. And so then when they're in life and they're getting ready to flip out, they can say, well, I had the experience before that I don't have to do this.
Yeah.
And then they start to get control over it. So I think that's the beauty of this idea of the art and science, is the science part is what gives you the glimpse of what, in a sense, we're aiming to grow into. And the other thought that came up while you were talking, Mr. Davis, I'm sure you've heard him say, would always say that really enlightenment or clarity of awareness is just a shift of viewpoint.
Yeah.
And as you talked about focusing on something, and you use the term limited.
Yeah.
And that's right, because when I was thinking, oh, I'm limited, I can't play that.
Yeah.
Well, then I couldn't. And the issue that comes up for a lot of people, and this is the next question I have for you that just came to me, was, why do you think it's so hard? Because even Ramana Maharshi would say this. He would say, just quit thinking that you are limited. Quit thinking that you are the body. Quit thinking that you are the mind. Why can't people give themselves permission just for a little while to have that experience of, wow, what if I wasn't the body? What if I wasn't the mind? What do you think the sticking point is there, or what trips people up?
Well, now you've actually triggered off a few thoughts in my mind. The first thing to comment is, I remember when Roy used to say, it's just a shift of attention. And that used to get me, because it was kind of like, well, if it's just a shift of attention, why can't I do it? And obviously I wanted to be the good meditator, the good yogi, and I wanted to be able to shift my meditator and get there. And I remember sitting and saying, okay, well, it's just shifting my attention, But although the words are simple, and Ramana Maharishi as well, he'd say, this is your natural state. Just awaken to your natural state. Just be there. You don't have to go through these huge processes. But sometimes the identification with, like, you are identified with that one thought when you're playing that song and it really distracted you. But if you're coming from a space in your life where there's a lot going on, and there's maybe you've really been through experiences which have just caused life to become very gross, and your mental processes are very much a reflection of those impressions that have been left in your mind. that idea of, well, you are that state, or you are, just shift your attention to what you really are. It doesn't really necessarily sound out to you in a way that it's going to be helpful. So that's why I think the process of yoga can be helpful, because they help people at every level of whatever they're coming with. And I'll have to be honest, like when I came to yoga, now whatever way I'm sounding now when I'm speaking on this podcast, but I definitely over-identified with thoughts, and I definitely just was fanatical about using techniques and endeavoring just to get it right. I'm going to get it right and get it right. And I think that's the whole thing. Again, getting back to that sutra about the balance of repeated practice and the balance of non-attachment. Because repeated practice is fine, but it's when we become like slaves to the practice in a way that is because like we're just doing it out of a fear of not being able to do it, out of that sense of attachment to having to be somebody who's doing this practice. And so the letting go part is equally as important, because not because you want to let go of actually sitting down to meditate, because the letting go will let you to let go of the thought processes which are keeping you identified with all the thought waves and all the different movements in the mind, which cause you to become identified with yoga. Now that might be a little bit complex, but just because we were talking about the practices, what will happen is somebody gets involved with the practices, gets involved with the procedures, they start creating new identifications and then they become their new thing in their mind. And it can become very hairy, very tricky, because now you're trying to tell someone, well, actually don't be attached to yoga itself. And so that's a bit paradoxical. So it's kind of, that's, I suppose, the art form side of things.
Well, it's the art form side of things, but what you just said makes me go back to figuring out in the first place, why are you even doing it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, being attached to something like yoga, well, let's say that you have depression, anxiety, or some mental health issues, and you drank a lot and smoked a lot. Okay. Well, you used drugs to pacify the mind so that you felt okay. Mm-hmm. And then what do? Well, then you give up drugs and alcohol, which is probably a good thing overall. And now you're just in this meditation technique and this philosophy. So now you're just using all your force to not be able to feel your pain and your anxiety. And you chant your mantras and you do your intense practices, but you're doing it with the same kind of motivation that you might as well just go take a drink and have a cigarette and enjoy it.
Yeah.
And that brings me to the idea of why are you doing it? And if it's because you don't feel good, or because you have some mental emotional stuff that you'd rather not feel or look at, well, that seems to be more of a realm of working with someone to get to the heart of that first. Yeah. But that's the difficult part, is they can easily be, people's devotion and ardor can often, I have to be honest, I don't know too many people that are just truly devotional and in love with God just because. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like it's a substitute for something else, I guess. And anyway, I don't know why that came up, but that's sort of what I started thinking of when you were describing that. Yeah.
Like when people get involved with yoga, and when you're talking about their our psychological temperament, or maybe the baggage, because we've all got baggage, what kind of stuff we've got going on, and how where we are in terms of how we're going to how much we're going to be able to get involved with the process of yoga in an effective way. I think that's where yoga kind of, it's really how we're introduced to it, because, okay, meditation's a big thing. And then, if you're getting involved with yoga and there people are, the teachers are talking about meditation, then there's so many different types of, there's so many different meditation techniques. Mm-hmm. And then there's, and and then there's the ideas about samadhi and having this experience of absorption. There's a lot of things which can just sound very beyond what we're used to in our ordinary experience before we became involved with yoga. And if we're coming to yoga with baggage and this kind of identifications in our mind and with the processes of our mind that are just very much gross and kind of distorting our perception of reality to a very, very a profound level, then it's going to be difficult for us to expect. It's difficult to expect someone to not start to make a mess of it in some ways, because it's not as easy as the system is and as easy as the concepts are. If you're coming with a lot of stuff, then it would be quite easy for you to apply all that stuff onto it and get something completely not erroneous, something which is not going to serve you, and get absorbed into that and start practicing it from that point of view. And I would admit that to a certain degree that kind of happened to me a little bit, because we just project all of our stuff onto what we think yoga is, and then yoga becomes a totally different beast.
Right.
and like and now when I'm looking at it after I mentioned in the last podcast, after a couple of years of taking a break from yoga and everything, like the whole idea of pure conscious being, that whole concept of pure conscious being, I just find it's actually so simple. It's just basically my mind is not distorted in any way. Like my consciousness is not distorted in any way whatsoever. It's just pure. Mm-hmm. But I think for many years, pure consciousness and the idea of higher realities and all this, it becomes kind of fantastical, and it's very nice and it's such a bright world and a bright experience to maybe what I'm identifying with in my ordinary states of consciousness, that even if I'm not aware of it. And for those people who are getting involved with yoga and they're not aware of it, when they come to yoga and they hear these words like higher realities and oneness consciousness and pure conscious being, you are a pure conscious being, it can take a while to navigate through all the layers of distorting that concept mm-hmm. before actually being able to appreciate what yoga has to offer. So. Yeah, maybe you want to say something there.
Yeah, I think this ties really back into the idea of the art of it, because the art of it is also growing with it.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, you probably started that same way. And, why did I get interested in yoga and meditation? Well, I looked around at the world and I thought, really, this is what I'm dealing with here. And you read Autobiography of a Yogi and you can be free of all this. Well, great, that's what I want. Mm-hmm. And I think the art of it is, just as you were intimating or describing, is being able to grow with it, being able to see as you go, oh, okay, well, I thought that this is what was going to happen, and I did bring all my baggage with it. But just by doing the practices, by doing the Kriya Pranayama, by trying to follow the yamas and niyamas to the best of your ability, that naturally shifts, changes, and alters your consciousness. And if you keep trying to live the way you used to be while your consciousness is shifting, that's what causes all this kind of like confusion and difficulty. And that's why non-attachment is so useful, because no matter where you start, whether you want to escape from pain, whether you're just innately blissful about this idea of God, no matter where you start, you're going to change.
Yeah.
And if you're attached to, if you want to be who you are, if you want to be who you were, just superhero version of it, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
You have to be able to say, well, this is who I was, and I'm actually becoming something this person wouldn't even recognize, person A wouldn't even recognize, and you have to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And that might be the scary part too.
I think that's it. I think, and when you talk about letting go and scary parts, isn't that like, that's one of the whole 5 attachments, isn't it? The fear of identity. And it's a very profound system, and there's so many, it's been approached and been shared with us from all angles, so that there would be as least confusion as possible. So the confusion arises just from what we put on it. But what you said there, but just by applying the process we are naturally going to purify our mind. And I think the one thing that is quite remarkable is that, for me anyway, speaking from my experience, I think there was an idea of, well, I'm going to become a perfect human being by doing this, by doing this yoga practice. That was, when you talk about motivation for getting into it, I wanted to be wise. I wanted to have the smarts, and so we're getting in with it, like, yeah. So if that's that's my projection, that's why I'm getting involved with it. When there is going to be a whole distorting of everything so that I can satisfy that need. Right. Whereas really the need is just basically to experience consciousness, which is pure consciousness. And
at some point in time, what you talked about, and I was actually talking to another CSA minister, Phil, who's been on this podcast. Yeah. He had written to me, and we were talking, and he said, well, I'd like to have a discussion about the persistence of individuality, the persistence of individuality. And I thought about that. And what came to mind is I wanted to ask him, are you sure it persists? Because I don't know why this is coming to me, but we think that, for example, like you were talking about wanting to be wise or a perfect being. Well, that requires that there's like an I, like there's a David, or that there is a personality. And even when we're in deep meditation, it seems like there is still, even when you get into what you might consider to be the clearest samadhi as far as you can talk about or remember, it seems like there's still a point of perspective, which can be related to the I.
Yeah.
But what if that is part of the illusion that we think it's still individuality, but that's the only way that we can relate to it from a mind that's limited.
Well, isn't that what Ramana Maharishi talks about? Like that's the seed. That's the seed thought. That's where it's all born from, and contemplating that I essence and getting to the source of that, and like I think it's in the Yoga Sutras, they break down the mind into the 4 faculties of mind, don't they? They break it down into the sense mind, and then the field of consciousness, and then our ego sense, the Ahamkara. And I think Rama Maharishi, he really puts an onus on that. And you know about this because you've studied it extensively, but just to say that it's, for him, there was no real, you don't need to go through the process of breathing and all these different things. It wasn't something he thought about. But in saying that, I've read anecdotes where he would talk to somebody in private and say, well, maybe you need to do this or this to get you to the point where you can contemplate the source of that I thought, that reoccurring thought, that single one thought that keeps you identified with the rest of everything else. And I think that's the way I like to look at yoga, as a systematic approach to help us to go through the levels of concentration as they're defined in the Yoga Sutras, the different states of concentration, which they call samadhi. You can get to the more subtle states of samadhi, the more subtle states, to arrive at the point when the object of focus is just I, like that, what is the seed? And then focusing in there and really honing in on it to the point that it dissolves or whatever happens. Right. The absorption occurs where it's transcended.
But you have to hold to it, and I think that's the important point. And I recently, I'm not sure if I read it or if I heard someone say it, but it was that amateurs do something until they're good at it, and professionals do something until they can't be bad at it.
Okay.
and so, for example, as a meditator, we can go to a point where we reach that I and maybe the dissolution of that I, and there was, but then, do we make it permanent? Do we keep going back to it until that is all we know? The amateur has the experience. Okay, great, I've got it.
Yeah.
But the quote professional would say, all right, let's get it so that it's never not there.
Yeah.
And I think that is in the Yoga Sutras, where it talks about practice is abidance as the self and non-attachment, because you have to be able to let go of all the other stuff to keep abiding as that self. And it's the Kriya Pranayama, it's the yamas and niyamas, it's the ability to practice pratyahara, to internalize your awareness, the ability to practice absorption, which gives you the strength of the strength and the capacity to do it, to stay there, to abide in that state. And then again, all these conversations I've had recently are coming to mind. I was giving a test to one of the astrological apprenticeship students that I teach, and he was in India, and he must have a very wise grandfather, because he said something like his grandfather told him once, you misunderstand the world, and then you think it's tricking you. So, you look around and you misunderstand everything, but because you misunderstand it, you think it's actually playing games on you or tricking you, but it's only because you don't understand it. Mm-hmm. And part of the whole process of yoga, it seems to me, is giving the space to see what's really going on. And again, the other idea of like when they use the example of a snake, you see a piece of rope, and you think that piece of rope is a snake. Mm-hmm. But no matter, you're going to think it's a snake until you actually see it's a rope. And then no matter what you do after that, you can't make it into a snake again.
Absolutely. In saying that, though, I do feel that the process, as you're taking the steps towards that piece of rope, like with our practice, because that state of concentration or the state of absorption, the first time, we might experience it to different depths, but we don't know the deepest depth until we've experienced it. But the initial depths will be equally significant to us. And just like as you're walking towards the rope, with each step, you get a little closer of a glimpse, and the fear and the doubt starts to dissolve step by step until you're finally there, and then it's completely eradicated. But I think there is a process which sometimes it can be underestimated or less spoken about in terms of yoga experience. But I think all of that cumulative experience that you can have as you progress in your yoga practice, it can give you a greater clarity of awareness in your day-to-day living, where reality is reflected back to you a little bit more like it actually is, rather than you skewing it and distorting it through your conscious movements. Right. And I think that sometimes that isn't spoken about enough. Sometimes we're always on about the end goal, and which is absolutely important, and obviously that's our objective. But maybe getting back to an earlier point when you're saying, how would you keep somebody motivated to be on their path? Because even within a short time, you can have a little kind of experience of, oh, well, now I'm seeing things a little bit differently here. I'm getting a little bit more objective. And for me, that reality, and like you're quoting that guy's grandfather, it is just seeing reality as it is. When we talk about higher realities, well, the highest reality is to see, well, not the highest, but a high reality is to be able to experience what's going on just as it is, rather than skewing it with all our distorted mental concepts and ideas. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And going back to the very beginning, we were talking about the mind and the thoughts rising and falling. Yeah. As you were talking about walking towards that rope, and we think it's a snake. Well, as we're walking towards it, we might catch glimpses. Oh, are we sure it's a snake? Yeah. And you don't know yet. So of course you don't want to just run up on it and grab it, because maybe it's poisonous. But you start to, well, maybe it's just rope. Yeah. But you still have to keep walking forward. Yeah. And so the same thing is true as the mind rises and falls, as the mind comes and goes, as the thoughts and emotions rise and fall. If we can kind of step back, and our meditation will help us do this too. It'll give us more perspective on our thoughts and our feelings. If we know that, well, we just need to keep moving forward, even though today we might not feel like it, or tomorrow we're really enthused, but just make it consistent and steady, and keep applying what we're learning, dancing with it, using the science, but dancing with it. The science is the beat is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The art is, how are we going to dance around that beat? And as long as we can keep dancing forward, moving forward, then eventually there it is. And then when you notice when you notice a rope is not a snake, it doesn't happen gradually. You just look down and, oh, Absolutely. Yeah.
It's not like it transforms from a rope slowly or from a snake slowly into a rope.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
bam.
I was thinking that because we're really pushing this analogy, but but as you're taking the steps forward, it's not really that it's getting clearer. It's just that your mind is starting to work out maybe a little bit of the doubts. It's starting to become more, it's purifying the fears maybe a little bit. But then, I'm really pushing the analogy, as you get to the snake, I suppose the last fear, the ultimate fear, is that you're going to have to, get close enough to actually decipher whether it's a snake or a rope. And I suppose if you compare that to the meditation and our process of going through the subtle levels of absorption, and then we get to that I seed, and then we're going to have to take that step into, well, I'm going to have to just let go of the I seed and get to decipher what's actually what's there without me,
Right.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of the science part of it. The beauty of the technique part of it is that I can remember when I first learned Kriya Pranayama techniques, and I went through and I did the process, and after I did those 14 repetitions, I was just present. And, it wasn't anything that I can recall as being like the world melted or anything,
Mm-hmm.
but just catching 2 to 3 minutes of no thoughts. Of course, they came back quickly.
Yeah.
But just catching in that in the very beginning, those 1, 2, 3 minutes of no thought. Well, that gives the experience of, well, look, see, you can still exist and be safe even without all these identifying thoughts. It gives you the glimpse of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more you do it, the more that expands and the more comfortable you get at it. It's just like challenging yourself. When you challenge yourself to do something you've never done before, mm-hmm. and you find out, wow, I actually did that and no one died. Well, now you know, hey, I can do all kinds of things. I think there's a part of human nature that yoga practice, Kriya Yoga practice, helps us to grow through. Really.
Yeah. Yeah, it gives us a confidence in our existence, which kind of recognizes that it's not just all subject to the human condition. Right. There's depths to reality, and when I talk about the depths of reality, I'm not going off to other higher realities. I'm just talking about there's depths to the mind and the way that we perceive things that with meditation practice we get to explore that. It's riveting, like in terms of how deep it can bring us in our understanding of ourselves and what's going on around us.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. Well, I think this was a good discussion to have for our listeners. So,
I feel like we could go on for another 40 minutes.
Yeah.
It's the art side. The art is very, once you talk about art, you could just do, there's so much to it.
Well, we'll let them digest this for a little bit, and then we'll see what we can find later on. But I want to thank you for taking the time to be here with us today and to share your thoughts with us.
That's great. It's absolutely great to take part in this conversation. Good.
Yeah, and I'll put your contact details within the description, the show notes of this podcast. So make sure you get those to me when we're done.
Okay, very good.
All right, Thanks, it was great to see you, David. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Take care.
You too.
This episode of the Kriya Yoga Podcast was made possible by donations from Kriya Yoga Apprenticeship students and supporters of our Patreon community at www.patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.